Well, hello, Crossing Church. How are you doing? Are you doing okay? It's good to see all of you. Great to be able just to share the word. I want to welcome everyone that's joining from our locations in Macomb, in Kirksville, in Hannibal, 929, Lima, Pittsfield. What I missed? Mount Sterling. Is that all of them? I said Hannibal. I said Macomb. And everybody else that I didn't remember. Man, I'm glad that you're joining. I'm glad that we get to be a family and how God is working inside that family. It's really awesome. And I want to say Happy Father's Day to all the fathers. I'm really glad that, you need to, thank you. Thank you. I am also a father. Appreciate that. I don't know what you have planned. It involves a lot of relaxing. I know that's what it is for me. And a steak is in there somewhere. So I'm excited about all of that. And I want you to be praying. I want you to be praying about Keokuk. I mentioned Keokuk a few weeks ago, and we have been talking to the elders of one of the churches in Keokuk, New Testament Christian Church, about partnering together and doing ministry together, and we're seeking the Lord on that. So it's our leadership and it's their leadership, both praying, how can we make the biggest impact for the kingdom? And I want you to be praying along with us that God would be glorified, that would be the decision that He'd want, that we would be following Him and not trying to put words in His mouth. And that's how we know that God will bless that. So be in prayer about that as we seek the Lord together. You know where we are? I can't even believe it. We are at the halfway point of the story. This is the 16th week of 32. It's pretty amazing. And I remember when we were talking about doing this, I was kind of scared because I was thinking, how are we going to keep people interested in a 32-week sermon series when we never go longer than 6 weeks in a sermon series? And you know what I'm thinking now? I'm going, what are we going to do after the story? I don't know what we're going to do because this has been so great. And for those of you that are just joining us, have only come maybe for a week or two or three, this is what we're doing. We decided to do a whole series that's an overview of the whole Bible, cover to cover. Because what we've realized is that a lot of us, we may know this story and another story, like these disconnected Bible stories, but we've never really been able to put them all together and see how all those smaller stories become this one big story and how they all fit together in a beauty and in a harmony that God has provided for us. And that's what this series has really been able to do. So we've gone all the way back to creation, and we've gone through the whole history of the world, and then how God worked particularly with the people of Israel. And now we're in that period of the divided kingdom, and there's northern kings and there's southern kings, and that whole period. This is the part of the Bible that Clayton likes to call the Badlands of the Bible. And I think he's right for at least two reasons. One reason is it's just a depressing part of the Bible. It's depressing because there's all sorts of things that people are doing that are outside the will of God. And it's like a droning. It's constant. It never stops. It's like, are you guys ever going to get this? It's just constantly negative. And it's also got a lot of names you can't pronounce and a lot of history that makes it hard. And so some people, if they're like reading the Bible, they want to stop in this because it kind of becomes a little discouraging. And so I can see why he might call it the Badlands of the Bible. But what it records is 208 years of nonstop spiritual decline. That's a long time. That's a long time to be sliding down this slope of being a godly kingdom to being a completely ungodly kingdom. And when we read about this time, between both the northern and the southern kingdom, there are 38 different kings. And this part of the Bible only tells us that there were 5 good ones. Out of 38, there were only 5. And a lot of them weren't like all the way good. But when you think about it, it is actually a pretty depressing part of the Bible. And God is having to do something here. Like, how do I get this nation to be my nation? I mean, these are the laws that I gave them. Here are the leaders that I put in front of them. Here's all of the precepts that I've created for them. Here's the temple. Here's the sacrificial system. Here's all these different things, but they don't care about any of it. Let me ask you a question. If you were God and these were your people, what would you do? If they just kept doing this stuff, what would you do? Would you wipe them off the face of the earth? Would you say, I'm just going to give up and start over? I mean, if you were God. Well, I'm glad that I'm not, and I'm glad that you're not. But this is what God did do. During this time of spiritual sliding, he raised up prophets. Men called prophets. And when he raised up these prophets, the prophets would go to the leaders and they would say, here's what God is saying. This is what God is expecting. And their life might be an illustration of it. They have all sorts of drama that happens in their life. And it's God's way of communicating to his people during this time when they're sliding like they are. In the Old Testament, there are 39 books. 17 of those books are prophets, major prophets and minor prophets. 2 of the 4 prophets that we're going to talk about today aren't even in those books of 17. They're actually in the other books, in the history books. And so there's just a bunch of information about prophets in the Old Testament. It's a major part of the Bible. Well, even though there's all of those prophets, we're only going to have time to talk about 4 today, and I got to go fast just to talk about them. And we're only going to hit a couple of highlights of their life. So you need to be doing your reading and being in your small group, because that's where you're really going to be able to dig down into these lives a lot more. But let's hit some highlights, okay? And the first prophet I want to talk about today is Elijah. We're going to call him the prophet of fire. And some of you who've already read, you know why I'm doing that, right? Elijah, the prophet of fire. In the Bible, of all the different prophets, I'd say Elijah is probably the most famous. Maybe not the most famous for what he wrote, but probably the most famous for the things that he did. And his life is linked to a king in Israel, one particular king. And that king's name is Ahab. King Ahab. What kind of a guy was King Ahab? Well, let's read 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 30. It says this, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He is a really bad king. And so a really bad king needed a really powerful prophet. And so God raises up Elijah kind of out of nowhere. Now, Ahab is known for his own evil, but he's also known for somebody else, and that's the woman he married. Because if he was evil, the only one who bested him in the world of evil, his Dr. Evil, was a woman named Jezebel. He married a woman named Jezebel. Now, at the 48th Street campus, we just did baby dedication, and I bet you there wasn't a single one of those children named Jezebel. I just want to dedicate my little girl to Jezebel. She's so cute. No, do you know? I know a guy named a dog Jezebel once. But I don't think I have ever in my entire life ever heard of anyone that named their child Jezebel. Why? Well, because she's a notoriously evil person in the Bible. And why, it's like naming your kid Satan. Why would you do that? I mean, maybe some people do. I mean, it's a strange world we live in, but that was who she was. And she was a completely dedicated follower of Baal. She was so dedicated as a follower of Baal, she had systematically killed off most of the prophets of God. Just had them done away with. It was just like, she was like this evil, wicked witch kind of lady. And she was as beautiful as she was evil. Ooh. You could make a Disney movie about her, couldn't you? You could. And so most of the story of Elijah happens inside the context of his confrontation with Ahab. And it begins in chapter 17 of 1 Kings, verse 1. It says, Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishba in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain in the next few years except at my word. So here the prophet of Israel puts the hammer down on Ahab and says, listen, it's not going to rain. Not going to be any rain. And you know what no rain means? It means drought. And you know what drought means? It means no crops. And you know what that means? It means no food. And that means everybody goes hungry. Right? And people die of starvation. Because what's God doing? He's saying, you people need to come back home. And that's why he says, except at my word. Well, this drought culminates in one of the most epic dramas of the whole Old Testament. It is a showdown. And a lot of us may have heard of this story before. It's Elijah versus the prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel. Now in Israel, if you go to the north, up close to the northern border of Israel, right over on the Mediterranean Sea, so it's right against the ocean, Mount Carmel rises up. And it was a high place where God wasn't worshipped, but foreign gods were worshipped. And we've talked a little bit about what that was like. So let's see what happens. It's in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21. And this is what Elijah says to all the people. Elijah went before the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. So it's Elijah that throws down this challenge. Let's just see whose God is God. And so the deal is struck. Let me tell you the story. On top of Mount Carmel, Elijah's going to build an altar. Prophets of Baal are going to build an altar. There's 400 of them. And they're going to build this altar too. Both of them are going to put wood on the altar. They're going to lay an animal, a dead animal on the altar like a sacrifice. And whichever God is going to burn that up. And so Elijah said, listen, you guys go first. Which is a pretty awesome thing to say, because it's like, he didn't even get a chance. I mean, there's no tie in this. So if they go first and Baal is able to burn up that sacrifice, Elijah won't even get a chance. But he just sits back, and so they start praying. And then the praying turns into dancing, and the dancing turns into singing, and the singing turns into chanting, and the chanting turns into craziness. And before long, they're drawing knives and swords and spears, and they're poking themselves and cutting themselves, and blood's going everywhere. And they're screaming and they're yelling, and it goes on all day. And eventually Elijah's like, when do I get a turn? Maybe he's on a vacation. Better yell louder. That's what he says. So they yell louder, doesn't work. And eventually, it says that they're so worn out from all of that all day long and bleeding to boot, all of that, they finally just give up, and it's getting toward evening. And Elijah goes, okay, they're done. My turn. And he makes an altar out of 12 stones, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. He puts his wood on it, puts the animal on it. And then he digs a trench around the altar. And then he brings one of the most precious commodities in Israel, water. And he pours water all over the sacrifice. He pours so much water on the sacrifice, it fills up the trench that's around it. And then he prays one little prayer. And as soon as he's done with that prayer, the Bible says that fire came down from heaven to earth and hit that sacrifice with such force that it exploded it. That it not only burnt up the sacrifice and the wood, it blew up the rocks, it licked up all the water, and there was nothing there but scorched earth when he was done. And all the people of Israel are like, whoa, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. He goes, so what are you going to do to those prophets of Baal? And they took 400 prophets of Baal and slaughtered them down at the base of the mountain. Because they said, that's God, the one who burnt up the sacrifice, the one who took out that altar. I've stood on that mountain. I've stood on that mountain. Let me tell you, that's a humbling experience to stand on that mountain. Not because of just some historical thing that happened there, but I want you to hear what I got to say. That mountain burnt with fire from heaven. Think about it. Not from this earth, but the fire of heaven came down on that mountain. And it's a humbling, almost frightening experience to stand there on that mountain and realize how God touched the earth. Wow. And you know what happened right after that? You know what happened right after that? He goes to Ahab and he goes, better get your umbrella out, because it's going to start raining. It's going to rain. And it started raining kind of like this season in Quincy. It started raining. Now, what do I take from that? Listen, you and I, we've got idols set up in our lives. There are things that are taking the place of God in our lives that have no business taking the place of God, and we're allowing them. And there's some of us, many of us, that are saying, oh yeah, I believe in God. I believe in God, but he's just one of the things that we believe in. And there's a lot of other things that are taking our time, that are taking our emotions, that's taking our love, taking our attention away from God. And there's a lot of us here and at all of our locations, there's a lot of us that feel like our heart is a dry and thirsty land. Right now, right this moment, right now. If other people knew how you really felt, they'd say, that guy's got a parched heart. That guy's got a heart like a desert right now. It's been waiting for rain. There's a lot of drought going on. I know that's happening. I know it's happening in a lot of hearts. Why do you suppose that's happening? Have you ever looked up to God and said, why isn't there rain? Maybe it's because God's saying, do you see what I see in your life? Pull down those idols. Take those prophets of Baal down to the brook and kill them. Get rid of them. Because your heart belongs to me. Your heart has to belong to me. Let me tell you something. When you start pulling those idols down, when you make a decision to start pulling those idols down, God's going to make it rain. He's going to make it rain in your heart. I guarantee you will. I guarantee it. And that's what's going on. That's what's going on. There's a spiritual battle inside of our hearts. And look where it began in the story. It began with a sacrifice. It began with a decision. It began with a spiritual marker. Go back to what Elijah said. He said, how long are you going to waver between two opinions? If the Lord's God, serve him. If Baal's God, serve him. And we start parceling ourselves out. A lot of us are doing that right now. And God's saying the same thing to us. It's a logical argument. You know what? Your greatest blessings are one decision away. And that's to say, the Lord, he is God. Because he can make it rain. Second prophet. I only get to do 4. It's killing me. And that's Elisha. Elisha was Elijah's protege. He was the young man that Elijah was raising up. And we first read about Elisha in 1 Kings 19 to 21. And I want to read that to you because it's just awesome what happens here. It says, so Elisha went from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat. What a name. And he was plowing with 12 of oxen, and he himself was driving the 12th pair, so that'd be 24 of them. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, he said, and then I will come with you. Go back, Elijah said. What have I done to you? So Elisha left him and went back. Now listen to this next part. He took his yoke of oxen and slaughtered them. He burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat, and he gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he set out to follow Elijah and became his attendant. You can stop right there. How cool is that? Guy's got 24 oxen. That's a lot to pull the plow. He's got farm equipment, farm implements. He's got all this stuff. And he goes, I want to say goodbye to my father. And he goes, well, I guess you don't want to follow me. So Elijah's heading on out. He goes back and he turns that farm equipment into a bonfire, kills all of his oxen, has a big barbecue, invites everybody from the community, has a big party and says, see you later. Do you know what I learned from that? The first thing I learned from that is Elisha burnt everything associated with his old life. He didn't have anything to go back to. When he decided to follow the Lord, there was no turning back. It's like that song we sing, I've decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. Well, we may sing it. Elisha lived it. He didn't have anything to turn back to. And do you know what Elisha's message was? If Elijah was the prophet of fire, Elisha was the prophet of faith. And this is where he was trying to draw the people back in. He said, my God will meet your needs, but you've got to trust him first. My God will meet your needs, but you have got to trust him first. I want to read 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. What a story about a widow. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my boys as his slaves. Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a little oil. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. She left him and afterward shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought out the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. And he replied, there is not another jar left. And then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go, sell the oil, pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. Is that a cool story? What do we learn from this story? My God will meet your needs if you put your trust in him. You see, God's provision was right there. But she was the one who determined the measurement. Listen to this. She's the one who determined the measurement of God's blessing. God's blessing was always there, but she had to determine the measurement of it. How did she determine the measurement of it? By how many jars she got, right? So God filled up all the jars that she brought. So the jars that she brought into that house is a measurement of how much she believed in God. And the same thing is true about you and me. Remember what Jesus said, give and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. It will flow into your lap. Listen, for with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. You determine, not him. He's not saying, I'm going to determine the standard of your measurement. He's your provider. You determine, by your faith, you determine the standard of measurement of God's blessing. That's what Jesus said, that's what Elijah taught. There is story after story about Elijah doing this. Whether it's a few loaves of bread that he fed 100 men with, or the great story of Naaman being cured of leprosy by having to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River. What an awesome story that is. How God can do those things. One of my favorite stories is Elisha's servant is scared because the Aramean army comes to capture Elisha, and they're on their way, and Elisha's standing outside of his house, and the man of God is going, his servant's going, what do I do? What do we do? They're coming, they're going to get us. What are we going to do? And he goes, God, open up this servant's eyes so he can see what I see. And then the servant's eyes were opened by God, and he looked around, and he said, all of the hills all around were covered with angels with swords drawn and chariots of fire. Nothing to worry about. Elisha is the prophet of faith. Here's what he teaches us. God will provide. Here's what he teaches us. God will heal. Here's what he teaches us. God will protect you. You have to have faith. Have faith in God. Trust in God. Believe in God. What does it say in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6? The writer of Hebrews is talking about faith, and he says this, and without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, listen to the next part, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. He what? What does he do? He rewards those who earnestly seek him. Well, what are those rewards? Well, it's his provision. It's his protection. It's his healing. It's the fact that he'll never leave you or forsake you. God provides for his people. He protects his people. He heals his people. He is the Lord who heals my diseases. You know, and some of us will go, well, you know, I had a bad cold and I prayed to God and it didn't go away. Really? Starting to sound like an Israelite in this 208 years. What have you done for me lately? Your biggest disease is the sin that brought you death, eternal death. And that disease, if you have accepted Christ, is healed. It's healed. It's amazing. Elisha, the prophet of faith. Let me ask you a question. Let's go back to the beginning of Elisha's life. Is there a decision that needs to be made in your life today? Is there something that needs to be laid down today? Is there some farm implements that need to be brought up here and set on fire? Are there some oxen that need to be butchered? Do we need to have a barbecue? Do you need to say, I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back? That's the question. That's what we learned from Elisha, the prophet of faith. I got 2 more and about 4 minutes, so hold on. Amos. These are 2 minor prophets, Amos and Hosea. Amos is the prophet of fear, and that doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound good that you'd have a prophet of fear. Like, why would God cause us to be afraid? You know, fear is not always a bad thing. You know, fear is an extreme measure, but in the absence of logic or in the absence of trust, then that's what we need. Think about it. With Elijah, it was about logic. It was like, is it going to be this opinion or is it going to be this opinion? Right? That's what it was with Elijah. With Elisha, it's faith. Who do you believe in? With Amos, it's like, well, we're not going to do logic and we're not going to do trust. Maybe the only thing I have left is fear. Does fear work? Actually, yeah, it does. A lot of us have been motivated by fear. And sometimes fear is the only thing standing between us and our destruction. Amos was a prophet who delivered threats because extreme sin sometimes demands extreme measures. I want to read from Amos chapter 5, verses 6. It's going to take me a little bit to find it. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum. That's where it is. Amos is after Amos. He's famous. Famous Amos. Here we go. Amos 5:6. Seek the Lord and live. Do not seek the Lord and live, or he will sweep through the house of Joseph like a fire. It will devour, and Bethel will have no one to quench it. Look down at verse 14. It says this, seek good, not evil, that you may live. Then the Lord God Almighty will be with you, just as you say he is. Hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts. Perhaps the Lord Almighty will have mercy on the remnant of Joseph. If you read after that, it's going to tell you what God's going to do. And let me tell you, it's scary. It's frightening. I don't think that God wants to frighten us. He wants to save us. But sometimes fear is the only thing that'll do it. How many of you, very quickly, how many of you there's something in your life that at one time in your life it scared you and you'll never do it again because it's got like a phobia about it now? Like, some people are afraid of water. I bet about everybody in here is afraid of food. Did your parents ever make you eat Brussels sprouts? Maybe you like Brussels sprouts. I don't know. Lima beans. Eat those, every one of those on your plate. You're not going to get up from this table. And sometimes fear can put something inside of our hearts and we just can't get rid of it, And maybe that isn't a bad thing when it comes to our rejection of God. So here we have a prophet of fire, a prophet of faith, a prophet of fear, one more prophet. And that's the prophet of forgiveness. It's the story of Hosea. Hosea in the Bible. And Hosea is a pretty amazing story. It's a unique story. It's unique because God is taking the very last measure he can in Hosea. Let me tell you the story. Well, let me read the passage and then I'll tell you the story. It starts in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. This is what it says. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing and lying and murder and stealing and adultery. They break all the bounds and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land mourns, and all who live in it waste away. Beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea are dying. Wow, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? So this is what God does. He tells Hosea the prophet, go marry a prostitute. What? Go marry a prostitute. And when she cheats on you, take her back. And if she cheats on you again, take her back. And if she cheats on you again, take her back. And so Hosea does what God tells him to. He marries a woman who's a prostitute. What in the world is God doing here? He's making his final plea, revealing his heart and his emotion to his people in their sin. He does it by way of this illustration. You see, God's used everything else. He's used logic. How long are you going to waver between two opinions? Did that work? Not for long. Then he used faith, and he said, listen, you can trust me. If you just reach out to me with your faith and your trust, I'll supply your needs. Didn't work. He tried to do it with fear. Listen, if you don't stop, it's all going to come down on your head. Nah, they got over that as well. The last thing he did is goes, don't you understand? Do you have no idea how much I love you? And this is what it feels like every time you do this idolatry. Here's the fact. All the love in the world and all the grace in the world won't save you. Not unless you want it more than what you're doing now. And the problem with this prostitute is even though she said, yeah, I'll stay with you, Hosea. I'll stay with you. She didn't love him more than what she'd been doing in the past. And how many of us, we say, oh God, I found you, I love you, but then we go right back to the stuff we used to do. Are we any different? Listen. When I look at Israel, what I see a wayward nation that God's chasing after. And when I look at myself sometimes, and I think maybe when you look at yourself sometimes, what you see is the same thing. And for some of us today, maybe that's what we need to say. I don't want to be the stray that has to constantly be chased. I don't want to be reminded all the time. I don't want to have to be encouraged all the time. I don't want to have to be frightened all the time. I don't want to be the servant that's always one step away from the pit of hell. I want to be the one that makes him proud. I want to be the one that's hooked up with my Heavenly Father, and he knows me and I know him, and I'm experiencing it personally. I want to read one more story. It's from 2 Kings chapter 2. And this is the very last part of Elijah's life. And I'm going to close with this. 2 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 1. I want you to hear what it's saying. says, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elisha said to Elisha, stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel. You can stay right here in Gilgal, Elisha. You've been a good servant. You stay here. This is familiar. There's a synagogue here. You can stay here. It'd be great for you. But Elisha said, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel, means house of God. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, do you know that the Lord is going to take away your master from you today? Yes, I know, Elisha replied, but don't speak of it. And Elijah said to him, stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho. And he replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. You can stay here with all your brother prophets. It'll be great. It'll be good for you. Nope, I'm not leaving your side. So they went to Jericho. The company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, do you know what the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, he replied, but do not speak of it. And Elijah said to him, stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan. You know, Jericho is a city of palms. It is a beautiful, beautiful place, an oasis in the desert. As he replied, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So the two of them walked on. 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance, facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. 50 of them looking from a distance. You know, if Elisha had stayed there at Jericho, he'd be one of those guys looking at Elijah from a distance. Keep that in mind. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. And the water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. He would have stayed back there. Would he have seen that? Did any of those 50 guys see that? When they got across, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me, what can I do for you before I'm taken from you? If he hadn't stayed with Elijah, would Elisha have ever heard that question? Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit, Elisha replied. Wow. You know what he's saying? I want to be twice the man that you are. You have asked a difficult thing, Elijah said. If you see me when I am taken up from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, not. And as they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. And he took a hold of his own clothes, and he tore them apart. And he picked up the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and went back and stood at the bank of the Jordan. Wow. My mentor, my teacher, my leader's gone. And the cloak falls from the air to the earth, and it lays on the ground, and he picks it up. And then he took the cloak that had fallen from him and struck the water with it. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He asked. And when he struck the water, it divided to the right and to the left, and he crossed over. That's the man that I want to be. That's the woman or the man that you need to be. Those need to be the children that you raise up, that are not okay with just staying one step out of hell, one foot on the precipice and the other one on a banana peel. Not that. Not that, not for you, precious child of God, not for your children, the precious children of God, not be the ones that have to constantly be chased, but to be the ones that seek the Lord in double portions. Because when that happens, the whole world is going to change because of what you do. We are moving to a time decision because I'm way over time.